The mule's scream tore through the night, like a blade through canvas echoing off the granite walls of Sandstone Bluff, until the sound twisted into something that made seasoned frontiersmen cross themselves and whisper prayers. Half the wagon train lay scattered across the dry basin below white canvas, torn and flapping like the wings of dying birds' wheels, still smoking from the rifle fire that had swept through the camp an hour past sunset. Kaga pressed himself against the boulder, feeling the rough stone dig into his shoulder blades through the worn buckskin shirt that had seen too many seasons and too many battles. The single eagle feather pinned to his dark braid hung limp against his neck, its once proud barbs now frayed from years of prairie wind, a reminder of honors earned in conflicts he tried not to remember when sleep came hard. The woman beside him trembled like autumn grass in a gale, her breathing coming in sharp little gasps that could get them both scalped if the wrong ears caught the sound. Her calico dress was torn at the shoulder, one thin strap, cutting into pale skin where someone had grabbed her hard enough to leave finger-shaped bruises. Dirt streaked her face, and strands of honey-colored hair stuck to her temples with sweat and terror. Bitte. Nicht aufhören. She whispered the German words, barely more than breath against his ear, before she caught herself and switched to English. Don't. Stop. Kaga's jaw tightened. Smart girl, she understood they had to keep moving, couldn't let the hunters pin them down against the rocks. His weathered hand pressed against her ribs, feeling the rapid flutter of her heartbeat through the fabric, as lantern light swept across the broken wagons below, like the eyes of hunting wolves. He pulled her down, guiding her along the rock face where shadow met stone. Every step had to be silent, as death itself every breath controlled despite the copper taste of fear in their mouths. The Spencer carbine slung across his back felt heavier than usual, its familiar weight both comfort and burden in equal measure. 5 rounds left, maybe 6, if his count was right in all the chaos. Not near enough for what was coming. A bullet sparked off granite inches from his head, sending stone chips flying like angry hornets. The woman bit back a cry that would have been her last, pressing herself closer to the unforgiving rock. Her body was warm against his side, shaking but moving when he moved, following his lead without the questions that would have gotten them killed. Below them, a man's voice boomed across the basin, rough with authority, and the kind of cruel pleasure that came from having power over the helpless. Come on out, Fräulein. We know you're up there somewhere. Make this easy on yourself and that savage you're hiding with. Bison Bill. Kaga had heard that voice before, knew the man behind it thick as a tree trunk, with hands like ham hocks and a laugh that could sour fresh milk. One of Kensington's key enforcers, the kind who enjoyed his work more than any decent man should. The woman's fingers clutched desperately at Kaga's forearm. Das ist er, she breathed, then caught herself again. That's him. That's one who took me. Another sweep of lantern light, closer this time, and moving with purpose. Kaga counted muzzle flashes, 8, maybe 10 rifles spread across the basin floor, like the points of a closing net. Too many for any kind of straight fight, especially with a frightened civilian to protect. The smart play was to keep climbing, put distance between them, and those guns find better ground for the killing that was sure to come. He touched her shoulder, felt her flinch like a spooked mare, then steady with the kind of control that spoke well of her chances. Good. Fear was useful if you knew how to ride it, deadly as a rattlesnake if you didn't. We go up, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the night wind. Step where I step, quiet as shadows. The climb was treacherous in the starlight, loose shale shifting under their boots with every movement. Behind them, the searchers' voices grew fainter, but no less dangerous. They'd spread out soon enough, try to cut off the escape routes like wolves driving deer toward waiting guns. Kaga had used those same tactics himself, back when he rode with the army as a tracker, before he learned whose side he was really on. At the rim of the bluff, he paused to let her catch her breath. The woman's face was pale as moonlight, but her blue eyes held steady despite the fear swimming in their depths. Not broken yet, not like too many folks he'd seen go down and never get back up, not where it counted. "My name is Lena," she said quietly, her accent making the words flow like music, even talking about death and terror. "Lena Richter." He nodded once, studying her face in the dim light. Names were dangerous things to share with strangers, but they'd already crossed that line when he'd pulled her behind the boulder instead of leaving her to Bison Bill's tender mercies. "Kega." He offered nothing more because histories were heavier than names and twice as likely to get you killed. She waited for more details, but he had none to spare. Below them, a bugle sounded 3 sharp notes that meant regroup and spread the net wider. The search was expanding beyond the basin, which gave them maybe minutes before the trap closed tight as a banker's fist. Thunder rumbled in the distance, or maybe it was hoofbeats. Hard to tell which would be worse. A storm would give them cover, but make travel dangerous as walking on knife edges. Riders would mean a running fight with odds that kept getting longer like shadows at sunset. He made his choice the way he always did, by picking the path that led away from certain death and hoping the ground ahead was more forgiving than what they'd left behind. "Then we ride," he said, and helped her to her feet with hands that were gentler than his reputation suggested. By the time dawn broke over the scrubland in shades of copper and gold, painting the endless stretch of sage and buffalo grass with the kind of light that made a man believe the world might be beautiful if he didn't know better. They'd put miles between themselves and the killing ground at Sandstone Bluff. Kega's roan mare picked her way through scattered rocks and prairie dog holes, her ears constantly moving as she tested the wind for signs they were still being hunted. Lena rode behind him, her arms circled around his waist with a grip that had started desperate and settled into something closer to trust as the hours passed. She'd stopped shaking when the first rays of sun touched the horizon, but he could still feel the tension in her shoulders whenever the wind carried a sound that might be pursuit. The mare crested a low rise, and Kaga reined her in to study their back trail with eyes that had learned to read the subtle language of disturbed earth and bent grass. Nothing moved in the morning heat, except a red-tailed hawk making lazy circles over something dead in the distance. Maybe Bison Bill's boys had given up for the night, gone back to report failure and nurse wounded pride. Or maybe they were just better at this game than he'd hoped. "Sie kommen immer noch nicht wahr." Lena's voice was steady despite the exhaustion that made her lean heavily against his back. She caught herself and switched to English. "They're still coming, aren't they?" "Might be. Hard to say for certain." He touched his heels to the mare's flanks, sending her down the slope toward a line of cottonwoods that promised water and shade. "Tell me about last night. What happened before the shooting started?" She was quiet for so long, he thought she might not answer. Might be one of those folks who locked their troubles away, where nobody could touch them. Then the words came slow at first, but gaining strength like water, finding its course. "We were 3 days out of Golden Field, maybe 20 wagons strong. Families, mostly folks heading west to find work or land or whatever it is people think they'll find in this Gottlos's place." Her accent made even the harsh words sound musical. The trainmaster was Crawford Guterman, careful with his charges. He'd posted guards proper had the wagons circled tight. The cottonwoods grew larger as they approached their leaves, rustling with the promise of cool water and merciful shade. Kega's mare pricked her ears forward, catching the scent of the stream that meant life in this harsh country. Crawford knew his business better than most. She continued her voice, taking on the distant quality that came with bad memories. "But these weren't Indianer who hit us. The attackers wore long dusters and red neckerchiefs rode with cavalry discipline. I saw their faces clear as day when the shooting started. Her voice hardened like steel cooling in water. One of them was the officer himself. "Officer." Kaga pulled the mare to a stop under the blessed shade of the trees. "The one in charge." Tall man with gray at his temples sat his horse like he'd been born to command soldiers. She paused, studying his face. "You know something about this man, don't you?" Kaga didn't answer immediately. Instead, he dismounted, carefully testing his weight on the leg that had been broken 2 winters back during a cavalry raid near Wind River. The memory was sharp as broken glass, a rifle butt to the shin wielded by an officer who'd smiled while he did it. A tall man with premature gray hair and eyes like winter ice. "Could be," he said finally. "What name did he go by?" "The others called him Major, but I heard one of them say Kensington when they thought I wasn't listening." The pieces clicked together like a well-oiled mechanism. Major Thomas Kensington, formerly of the 3rd Cavalry, now mine foreman at Fire Creek. The same man who'd led the dawn raid that scattered Kaga's band and left him crawling through snow with a shattered leg bone. The world was smaller than most folks realized, and old debts had a way of coming due when you least expected them. Lena knelt beside the stream, her movements careful and deliberate. "Könnten Sie mir helfen?" At his questioning look, she tried again. "Could you help me?" The bandage he'd tied in the darkness was soaked through with blood and something that smelled like infection starting. When he peeled it away with fingers that had gentled wild horses and soothed frightened children, his jaw went tight as a steel trap at what lay underneath. Fresh welts crossed her back in neat, deliberate lines, the kind that came from a whip wielded by someone who knew exactly how much pain to inflict without doing permanent damage to valuable property. But it was the mark burned into her shoulder blade that made his stomach turn cold as winter creek water. A brand. The letter K burned into her pale skin inside a neat circle, the edges still raw and weeping like an open wound. "Mein Gott." He breathed, then caught himself. "When?" 2 days passed. "They took me from the wagon train at night, said they had papers giving them the right by law." Her voice was steady, but he felt her tremble under his careful touch as memories surfaced. "They had a ceremony of sorts. Said I was bound to the Major by law and custom, that fighting it would only make things schlimmer." Kaga reached for his knife, a worn but sharp blade he'd carried since his first hunt as a boy. He placed it in her palm handle, first his calloused fingers covering her smooth ones for just a moment. The contact sent warmth up his arm that had nothing to do with the morning sun. "If I hurt you, if I do something wrong, use it." She looked down at the knife and then back at his weathered face. Something passed between them in that moment, not trust exactly, but the beginning of it. The first fragile thread of understanding between 2 people who'd both learned that the world was full of wolves and precious few shepherds. "Warum haben Sie mir geholfen?" The question came out in German before she could stop it. "Why did you help me?" He was quiet for a long moment, cleaning her wounds with creek water and strips torn from his spare shirt. His movements were careful, almost gentle, like someone who understood that healing required patience as much as skill. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decisions made and prices paid. "Last season, I started guiding settlers through this country. Good money, honest work when you can find it." He paused, considering how much truth to share. "Helps my people too. When the wagon trains make it through safe, nobody blames the Lakota when they don't." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was true enough for now. He didn't tell her about the cavalry raids on his band's winter camp, or the way soldiers smiled when they burned lodges filled with old people and children. He didn't tell her about friends who died because some white men couldn't tell one Indian from another, or the way his own people sometimes looked at him when he came back from guiding the same kind of folks who'd brought them so much grief. Some truths were too heavy to share with strangers, even strangers who'd shared blood and bullets in the dark. "You're good at it," she said, testing her shoulders and finding she could move without too much pain. "The protecting, I mean." He finished wrapping her wounds and started gathering their gear. The morning sun was climbing higher, burning off the last of the cool air that made travel bearable. Soon, they'd need to find better shelter, make plans for whatever came next. "We should move," he said, helping her to her feet with a hand on her elbow that lingered perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. "They'll be tracking us by now, and daylight makes us easy to spot." She nodded automatically, positioning herself so she could see their back trail while he prepared the mare. Learning fast, which was good. Folks who couldn't adapt to this country usually ended up feeding the buzzards. "Where do we go now?" she asked. "Depends." He checked the mare's hooves for stones, tested the makeshift bridle they'd fashioned from rope. "What do you want, justice or just to get away clean?" Her blue eyes hardened, and for a moment he saw past the pain and fear to something colder and more dangerous underneath. Something that reminded him of winter wolves, driven by hunger to take risks they'd normally avoid. "Bade," she said firmly. "Both." The sun climbed toward its merciless noon position as Kaiga led the mare along the rim of the basin, reading sign in the dust and broken grass, with eyes that had learned to see stories written in disturbed earth. What he found there made the coffee he'd drunk at dawn turn sour in his stomach. Brass cartridge cases scattered in the dirt, but not the kind that came from trade rifles or civilian weapons. These were Army-issue .45-70 government rounds from Springfield carbines, fresh enough that the metal still gleamed like fool's gold, and there were too many of them to count without getting down on hands and knees like a bloodhound. But it was what he didn't find that told the real story, painted a picture that made his anger burn hotter than the desert sun. "Keine Mokassin Abdrücke," he muttered in a mixture of German he'd picked up and Lakota. "No moccasin prints anywhere, no pony tracks, no arrows stuck in wood." Lena dismounted and knelt beside him, studying the ground, with eyes that missed nothing important. In the clear morning light, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 23 or 24, with the kind of pale beauty that belonged in drawing rooms, rather than running from killers across godforsaken prairie. "But there's this," she said, holding up a torn piece of red cloth, the kind used for neckerchiefs by men who wanted to look dangerous and mean. The fabric was good quality wool, not the rough cotton most cowboys wore. Kaga took the cloth, rubbed it between his fingers, while his mind worked through implications that grew uglier by the minute. "They're framing my people." He said the words, tasting like ashes. "Attack the wagons, leave Army brass lying around like breadcrumbs. Let folks draw their own conclusions about savage Lakota raiders." They rode back down into the basin, where the wagons sat like broken teeth against the morning sky. Under an overturned wagon, Lena found what she'd been looking for, a canvas-wrapped packet she'd managed to hide when the shooting started. Inside was a leather-bound ledger that made Kaiga's stomach turn as she flipped through pages covered with careful handwriting. Names and numbers, dates and amounts. But not the kind of bookkeeping any honest business would keep. These were records of human transactions, contracts bought and sold like livestock at market. Women's names featured prominently, along with terms like housing credits and debt transfers that made his jaw clench. Near the bottom of one page, an entry caught his eye. Territorial oversight. Payment pending approval from DC Contact. Below that, in different handwriting, railroad expansion requires additional labor acquisition. Coordinate with Eastern interests. Lena's name was there too, along with a note that made his blood run cold. Special acquisition for personal use. Previous discipline methods proved effective. Payment cleared by TK. Report to Territorial Supervisor monthly. There's more to this than just Kensington, Kaga said, pointing to the entries about territorial oversight and Eastern interests. Someone higher up the chain is calling the shots. Lena asked, then caught herself. Who? Don't know yet. But someone with connections in Washington and money to burn on this kind of operation. He folded the ledger inside his belt. We need to get this to authorities who'll listen. Angel's Crossing has a telegraph station. Night wires had gone out hours earlier via the railroad relay, which explained how the U.S. Marshals rode in so quickly. But as they mounted the mare and rode toward the distant settlement, neither of them noticed the rider watching from a ridge 2 miles away, or the small mirror flashing signals in the morning sun. Angel's Crossing squatted on the prairie like a tired dog, its few weathered buildings clustered around a water tower and some corrals. Inside Hartman's saloon, the familiar smells of whiskey and tobacco mixed with tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The bartender was a thin man with nervous eyes. Help you folks? Whiskey, Kaga said, laying a silver dollar on the scarred bar. And information. Before the bartender could respond, 3 men entered, spurs jingling against the wooden floor. The speaker was a tall man with a deputy's star and a smile that never reached his eyes. Acting Deputy Rick Grogan, the man said. And you two are coming with me. The confrontation that followed was brief but violent. Glass-eyed Joe kicked over the card table, providing cover as Kaga and Lena fought their way to the back door. They escaped on horseback, but not before Kaga noticed something troubling one of the deputies had been writing in a small notebook throughout the encounter, documenting their appearance and movements with the precision of someone filing a report. The dust storm that caught them hours later was a blessing and a curse. It provided cover from pursuit, but nearly killed them both. They found shelter in a buffalo wallow pressed together under a woolen blanket as the world tried to tear itself apart around them. Wie lange noch? Lena asked, her voice muffled by the cloth over her face. Until it's over. Kaga replied, acutely aware of her body pressed against his. In the choking darkness, their hands found each other and held on like anchors against the chaos. When the storm finally passed, they emerged to find their horse had survived, but their supplies were mostly gone. They were on foot in hostile territory, with limited water and no food beyond what Kaga could hunt or forage. The next 3 days tested them both in ways neither had expected. They walked through scorching heat that made their lips crack and their tongues swell, following game trails and dry creek beds that might lead to water or might lead to death. At night, temperatures plummeted, leaving them shivering together for warmth while coyotes howled in the distance. On the second morning, Lena's feet were so blistered she could barely walk. Without complaint, she tore strips from her petticoat to wrap them, and then continued following Kaga across the unforgiving landscape. He watched her adapt with growing respect. This wasn't the pampered house girl he'd first rescued, but someone discovering reserves of strength she'd never known she possessed. That afternoon, they encountered their first real test of survival. Kaga had been leading them toward what his memory suggested might be a hidden spring when they rounded a boulder and found themselves face to face with a mountain lion. The big cat was crouched over a fresh kill, its yellow eyes fixed on them with predatory interest. Don't move. Kaga whispered, his hand slowly reaching for his knife. Don't even breathe hard. The lion was maybe 30 feet away, close enough to cover the distance in 2 bounds. But it was also protective of its kill, torn between defending its meal and eliminating potential threats. For long seconds, they stood frozen in a deadly tableau. Lena's breathing was shallow, but controlled. She'd learned enough in their time together to understand that panic meant death. Instead, she watched Kaga's face, ready to follow whatever signal he gave. The standoff broke when a raven landed on the lion's kill, cawing loudly as it tried to steal a morsel. The big cat's attention shifted for just an instant, and Kaga used that moment to slowly back away, pulling Lena with him. They moved with agonizing care, one step at a time, until they were around the boulder and out of sight. Only then did Lena allow herself to tremble. "My God," she whispered. "I thought we were dead." "We would have been if you'd panicked," Kaga replied, genuine admiration in his voice. "You're learning to think like the country thinks." That evening, they made camp in a sheltered depression where Kaga managed to snare a prairie chicken. As they shared the meager meal beside their small fire, Lena asked about his past. "The raid where you were hurt," she said quietly. "Tell me about it." "Wakan Skan," he said in Lakota, then translated. "Sacred power turned evil." It was the middle of winter. Our band was camped in a sheltered valley. Women and children, old people who couldn't travel fast. His voice carried the weight of old pain. Kensington led 2 troops of cavalry in a dawn attack. Said we'd been raiding settlements, stealing horses. All lies. How do you know it was lies? Because we'd been there all winter, hunting and preparing for spring. The real raiders were probably white men in war paint. But it was easier to blame us. He stared into their small fire, seeing flames that had burned 2 years ago. Kensington broke my leg with his rifle butt while I was trying to protect an old woman. Laughed while he did it. But that wasn't what made me quit the army. Lena waited, sensing there was more to the story. 3 months later, I was back on my feet working as a scout again. Command gave me orders to track down what they called hostiles. Turned out to be a family group, maybe 20 people total, mostly women and children fleeing from a reservation where they were starving. His jaw tightened. Orders were to bring them back dead or alive, with a preference for dead. Said it would send a message. "What did you do?" "Let them go." Told command I'd lost their trail in a creek. He met her eyes across the fire. That's when I knew I couldn't keep wearing the uniform. Some orders aren't meant to be followed. Lena nodded slowly, understanding the weight of that choice. I had orders too, in a way. From my mother before she died. She made me promise to find a better life in America, no matter what it cost. Her voice grew distant. She sold her wedding ring to help pay for my passage, told me I was the family's hope for the future. What happened to her? Consumption the winter after I left. I didn't learn about it until 6 months later when a letter finally caught up with me. Tears glittered in her eyes. She died thinking I was living the dream she'd sacrificed for. Instead, I was scrubbing floors and dodging the wandering hands of men who saw me as property. "She would be proud of you now?" Kaga said softly. "Fighting back instead of accepting what others decided for you." "Would she? Sometimes I wonder if she'd think I'd brought shame on the family name by not staying quiet and grateful." Lena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. In the old country, women who fought back were called troublemakers, unwomanly. In my people's way, women who fight for what's right are called warriors. Kaga replied. There's no higher honor. Their hands found each other across the small fire fingers, intertwining as the stars wheeled overhead. Neither spoke of the growing connection between them, but both felt it something deeper than shared danger, stronger than mere attraction. On the third day, just when their water was nearly gone, and death from thirst seemed inevitable, Kaga's memory proved true. Hidden in a fold of rock almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, a spring bubbled up from deep underground. The water was cool and sweet, the most beautiful thing either of them had ever tasted. They found Snake River that evening, and more importantly, they found each other in ways that went beyond survival. The ordeal had stripped away pretenses and revealed the people they truly were, not the scout and the house girl, but two souls who'd recognized something precious in each other. As they helped each other down the muddy bank to the water's edge, their eyes met and held. Something had changed between them during the ordeal, not just attraction, but genuine respect, and the kind of deep connection that came from shared hardship. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what? For not leaving me behind when it would have been easier. For teaching me to see this country's beauty instead of just its dangers." "Mitakuye oyasin," he replied in Lakota. "All are related. We're stronger together than apart." She didn't ask for translation. Somehow she understood. They were filling their makeshift water containers when the ambush came. 3 men emerged from concealment, but these weren't the usual Fire Creek thugs. These were professionals, quiet, efficient, and well-armed. The leader was a man Kaga didn't recognize, dressed like a businessman, but moving like a soldier. "Mr. Kaga, Miss Richter, you've led us quite a chase." "Who are you?" Lena demanded. "Someone who cleans up other people's mistakes." Kensington was supposed to handle this quietly, but he let personal grudges interfere with business. The man's smile was colder than winter wind. "I'm here to correct that error." The fight that followed was desperate and brief. Kaga's knife took one man in the ribs, while Lena used the skills he'd taught her to trip another into the river. But the leader had his gun drawn and aimed at Lena's chest before they could reach him. "Enough," the man said calmly. "You've caused considerable inconvenience to some very important people. People who prefer to remain anonymous but have resources you can't imagine." "Let me guess," Kaga said, positioning himself between the gun and Lena. "Railroad barons, politicians, someone who needs cheap labor for their grand projects." The man's smile widened. "Perceptive. Yes, there are contracts to fulfill, deadlines to meet. The Transcontinental Railroad won't build itself, and immigrant labor is so much more manageable when properly motivated. By slavery and murder. By whatever means necessary. This territory is changing, becoming civilized. There's no room for sentiment or misguided morality." He cocked the hammer on his revolver. "Nothing personal, you understand. Just business." That's when Glass-Eyed Joe's rifle cracked from the far bank, and the bullet taking the businessman in the shoulder and spinning him around. Joe emerged from behind a boulder, his weapon trained on the wounded man. "Been tracking you folks for 2 days, the old scout said. "Figured you might need some help about now." The wounded businessman was still dangerous, his gun hand steady despite the blood soaking his shirt. "You have no idea what you're interfering with, old man. This goes higher than territorial politics. People in Washington, New York, men who own railroads and senators." "Don't much care," Joe replied. "Right's right, wrong's wrong. Simple as that." The standoff might have continued, but fate intervened in the form of a rattlesnake that chose that moment to emerge from the rocks near the businessman's feet. His startled movement was all Kaga needed. He closed the distance in 2 quick steps, his knife ending the threat permanently. As they searched the dead man's belongings, they found documents that confirmed their worst fears. Letters from a railroad company, orders from someone identified only as the supervisor, and a list of territorial officials who were receiving regular payments. "This is bigger than we thought," Lena said, studying a telegram about the number of hands were owed. and train timetables. Big enough to get us all killed if we're not careful, Joe added. Question is, what do we do about it? Angel's Crossing looked different when they returned. More federal activity, more strangers asking questions. But their allies were busy too, fighting their own battles against the corruption that threatened to consume everything decent in the territory. In her small schoolhouse, Dorothea worked by lamplight, long into the night, carefully crafting messages that she hoped would reach the right people in Washington. She'd already sent 3 telegrams through official channels, only to learn that they'd been intercepted and lost somewhere in the territorial communication system. There has to be another way, she muttered, studying a map of telegraph lines that crisscrossed the territory. Her finger traced a route that bypassed the main territorial office, connecting directly to a federal relay station 200 miles east. Dr. Frederick knocked on her door just after midnight. Any luck with alternative communications? Perhaps. There's a railroad telegraph office that operates independently of the territorial system. If I can convince the night operator to send an unofficial message. What about the townspeople? How many can we count on if things get ugly? Dorothea considered the question carefully. Mild Mike at the livery, definitely. Widow Smith has lost too many friends to territorial accidents to stay neutral much longer. Maybe a dozen others who are tired of looking the other way. Not many against what's coming. No, but it might be enough to protect witnesses until federal help arrives. The question is whether Kaga and Lena will live long enough to testify. Neither of them noticed the shadow that detached itself from the alley beside the schoolhouse or the soft footsteps that carried news of their conversation to interested parties. The next morning, Dorothea made her attempt. The railroad telegraph office was a small building near the water tower, manned by a single operator during the night shift. She approached him with a story about family news that needed to reach Denver urgently. I can't send personal messages on company lines, the operator said, but his eyes were sympathetic. Policy is strict about that. What if it wasn't exactly personal? Dorothea asked carefully. What if it was about territorial business that might affect railroad arrangements? The operator, a young man named Peter, who'd seen too many strange things in his months working the night shift, studied her face. What kind of territorial business? The kind that involves forced labor and murdered witnesses. The kind that might eventually involve federal investigations that could shut down rail traffic for months. Peter was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the telegraph key. Finally, he nodded. Give me your message. But if anyone asks, you were never here. Dr. Frederick, meanwhile, was having his own success gathering allies among the townspeople. The turning point came when he showed Widow Smith the medical records he'd been keeping, documented injuries consistent with whip marks, suspicious deaths that had been ruled accidents, women who disappeared without explanation. My own daughter asked questions about where the German girls were going. Smith said, her voice thick with suppressed anger. Next thing I knew, she'd taken a job in Silver Spur and stopped writing letters. Haven't heard from her in 6 months. Help us protect the witnesses, Frederick urged. Help us make sure the truth gets told for once. By dawn, they had their network in place, small, fragile, but determined to do what was right, even if it cost them everything. Neither Dorothea nor Frederick had any illusions about the danger they faced, but both had reached the point where silence felt like complicity. When Kaga, Lena, and Joe arrived that afternoon, they found Angel's Crossing transformed into something resembling an armed camp. But before they could fully appreciate their allies' efforts, the enemy struck back with overwhelming force. They have your cousin Tala. Took him 3 days ago while he was scouting for a wagon train. Dorothea reported, her face grim with the knowledge of what that meant. The news hit Kaga like a physical blow. Tala was barely 16, brave and skilled, but no match for professional killers. Where? Dagger Point. There's a railroad junction there, perfect for moving people quickly and quietly. But it's also where they're gathering all the evidence before destroying it. It's a trap, Joe said flatly. They're using the boy to draw you in. Doesn't matter, Kaga replied. Family is family. Mitakuya Oyasin, we don't abandon our own. Lena stepped closer, her hand finding his arm. We don't abandon our own, she corrected. I'm coming with you. This isn't your fight anymore. Like hell it isn't. That boy's in danger because they're using him to get to us. And if we don't stop this now, how many more women will disappear? How many more families will be destroyed? Joe nodded approvingly. Girls got sand. We'll need all the help we can get. They spent the rest of the day planning gathering supplies and preparing for what would likely be their final confrontation with Kensington's organization. Dr. Frederick provided medical supplies and promised to document everything for the federal authorities. Dorothea showed them the confirmation telegram she'd received from Washington. Federal marshals were en route, but they might not arrive in time. Whatever happens at Dagger Point, she said, the truth will get out. I promise you that. But even as she spoke, all of them knew that promises were fragile things in a territory where money and violence had corrupted so many institutions meant to protect the innocent. As they prepared to leave Angel's Crossing, Kaga took Lena aside for a private moment behind the schoolhouse. The setting sun painted her face in shades of gold and crimson, making her look like something from a half-remembered dream. There's something I need to say, he began, then stopped, struggling with words that seemed inadequate for what he felt. I know, she said softly, her hand touching his cheek. I feel it too. But let's survive this first, then we can talk about what comes next. He nodded, then impulsively pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. They stood like that for a long moment, drawing strength from each other's presence, knowing that tomorrow might bring death for one or both of them. Wakan, he whispered. Sacred. Ja, she replied. Sacred. The railroad bridge at Snake River stood black against the evening sky, its iron trestles reaching across the dark water like the skeleton of some massive beast. From their hiding place in the willows, Kaga studied the structure through his field glass counting guards and looking for Tala. 8 men on the bridge itself, he reported quietly. Maybe more in the freight cars on the far side. Any sign of your cousin? Joe asked. There. Kaga pointed toward the center span where a small figure sat hunched against a support pillar. They're not even trying to hide him. Classic bait. Question is, what's the real trap? Lena studied the scene with eyes that had learned to see patterns and dangers. They know we're coming, so why make it so obvious? Before anyone could answer, they heard the distant whistle of an approaching train. Through the field glass, Kaga could see the locomotive's headlight growing brighter as it approached from the east. That's our target, Joe said. Paymaster's car with all the evidence, plus whoever's really running this operation. They had planned carefully, but as the freight train approached the bridge, everything began to go wrong. The first sign was the explosion, not where they expected it, but underneath the bridge itself. Someone had rigged the entire structure with enough dynamite to bring it down. It's not a rescue, Lena realized with dawning horror. They're going to destroy everything, the evidence, the witnesses, all of it. The locomotive was halfway across when the charges detonated in sequence, each explosion tearing apart another section of the bridge framework. But instead of falling cleanly into the river, the train cars twisted and bucked and twisted, some falling, while others remained precariously balanced on the collapsing structure. In the chaos that followed, Kaga saw his chance. While guards scrambled to maintain their positions on the disintegrating bridge, He slipped into the framework and made his way toward Tala. The boy was exactly where they'd seen him, hands bound a grain sack over his head, but alive and uninjured. Kaga cut his bonds quickly and pulled the sack away. "Can you climb?" he asked in Lakota. Tala nodded, his young face pale but determined. They began working their way back through the twisted metal, but progress was slow and dangerous. Steam from the wrecked locomotive filled the air, making visibility poor and breathing difficult. That's when they heard the voice that chilled Kaga's blood. "Going somewhere, Breed." Major Thomas Kensington stood on a partially collapsed section of bridge, decking his military bearing intact despite the chaos around him. He held a revolver in each hand, and his smile was the same cold expression Kaga remembered from that winter raid 2 years ago. "I have to admit, you've been more trouble than I expected," Kensington continued, "but also more useful. Your little crusade helped us identify watch weaknesses in the organization." Organization. Kaga kept moving, using the conversation to mask his progress toward better cover. "Did you really think I was the top of this operation? I'm middle management at best. The real power lies with men whose names you'd recognize, men who own railroads and senators." Kensington's gun tracked Kaga's movement. "The territorial expansion requires labor, lots of it, and immigrant workers are so much more compliant when properly managed. By slavery and murder. By whatever means serve the greater good. This territory will be civilized, whether you savages like it or not." The first shot came close enough that Kaga felt its wind. He pushed Tala toward what remained of the ladder rungs while drawing his knife. But Kensington had learned caution. He stayed back, using his gun's range advantage. "You know, I remember you," Kensington said, advancing slowly. "That winter raid when you tried to protect that old squaw? I enjoyed breaking your leg almost as much as I enjoyed watching your precious band scatter like rabbits." Rage built in Kaga's chest, but he controlled it. Anger made men stupid, and stupid men died young. Instead, he focused on protecting Tala while looking for an opening. That's when Lena appeared behind Kensington, like a ghost moving silently across the twisted metal with the stealth Kaga had taught her. She held a piece of broken rail iron, heavy enough to crush a skull if properly applied. But Kensington had survived too many battles to be caught completely off guard. He spun at the last second, one gun swinging toward Lena, while the other remained trained on Kaga. The next few seconds unfolded like a nightmare. Lena's improvised weapon connected with Kensington's gun hand, sending one revolver spinning into the dark water below. But the impact threw her off balance, and she stumbled toward the edge of the broken decking. Kaga lunged forward, catching her wrist just as she fell. For a heart-stopping moment, she dangled over the churning water filled with debris from the bridge collapse, her weight pulling him toward the edge. "Let her go." Kensington snarled, his remaining gun now pointed at Kaga's head. "Or I'll put a bullet in your brain and watch her fall anyway." "No deal," Kaga replied, muscles straining as he fought to pull Lena to safety. That's when the Spencer rifle boomed from the riverbank. Joe had found a shooting position and placed his shot perfectly, the heavy bullet, taking Kensington in the chest and spinning him around. The revolver flew from his hand as he collapsed onto the twisted metal. Kaga hauled Lena up onto the decking, both of them breathing hard from exertion and terror. But as they helped each other to their feet, Kensington spoke again, blood frothing from his lips. "You think this changes anything?" he gasped. "Kill me, and there's a dozen more to take my place. The supervisor has resources you can't imagine. Political connections, from here to Washington." "Who is the supervisor?" Lena demanded, kneeling beside the dying man. Kensington's smile was bloody but triumphant. Someone who's been watching this whole operation. Someone who knows exactly who you are and where you'll run. His eyes fixed on Lena with malicious satisfaction. Did you really think your escape was luck? You were allowed to run, so we could follow you to anyone else who might cause problems. The implication hit them like a physical blow. They hadn't escaped, they'd been used as bait to identify other threats to the organization. The telegrams, Kaga realized. The federal marshals Dorothea contacted, all monitored. Kensington wheezed. The supervisor has people everywhere. By now, your friends in Angel's Crossing are probably entertaining some very special visitors. He died with that same cold smile, leaving them to contemplate the full scope of their situation. They'd won the battle, but possibly lost the war. Worse, their friends were now in danger because of their actions. As they made their way off the collapsed bridge with Tala, they found Joe waiting for them with grim news. Been listening to telegraph traffic, the old scout reported. Lots of official sounding messages about watch concerns and territorial stability. Federal marshals are coming all right. But so are a lot of other folks who might not have our best interests at heart. We need to get back to Angel's Crossing, Lena said urgently. Warn Dorothea and the others. Might be too late for that, Joe replied. But we can try. The ride back to Angel's Crossing was the longest of their lives. They pushed their horses hard through the night, following railroad tracks and stage roads, always watching for signs of pursuit or ambush. As dawn broke, they could see smoke rising from the direction of the settlement. What they found when they arrived was worse than they'd feared. Angel's Crossing was crawling with men in business suits and territorial badges, all asking questions and taking names. Dorothea's schoolhouse was closed, its windows dark. Several townspeople stood in small groups, talking in whispers and casting nervous glances at the strangers. Miss Dorothea's been arrested, Widow Smith told them quietly when they approached her boarding house. Charged with sedition and interfering with territorial watch. They took her away this morning along with Dr. Frederick and anyone else who'd been helping you folks. The news hit them like physical blows. Their friends were paying the price for their crusade against Kensington's organization. Where did they take them? Kaga asked. Territorial prison in Silver Spur, most likely. But word is they might not make it that far if the right kind of accidents happen during transport. As they absorbed this devastating news, a well-dressed man approached from across the street. He was tall and distinguished with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Two armed men flanked him, and their eyes constantly scanning for threats. Mr. Kaga, Miss Richter, the man said pleasantly. I believe we need to talk. You're the supervisor, Lena stated rather than asked. Among other things, railroad agent for the territory might be more accurate, but titles are less important than results. His smile was warmer than Kensington's, but somehow more frightening. You've caused us considerable inconvenience, but also provided valuable information about weak spots in our guards, in our arrangements. Let our friends go, Kaga demanded. They're innocent. Innocent of what interfering with legitimate territorial business, spreading seditious lies about respected officials. I'm afraid innocence is a matter of perspective. The supervisor gestured toward the main street where more armed men were taking positions. You have a choice to make. Come with us quietly, and your friends will receive fair treatment through proper legal channels. Resist, and I'm afraid accidents might occur. It was the ultimate trap: surrender and face certain death or fight and guarantee their friends would die. The supervisor had outmaneuvered them completely, using their own consciences against them. But sometimes desperate situations called for desperate measures. "Wakinskan," Kaga murmured in Lakota, then louder. "All right, we'll come with you." The supervisor smiled triumphantly. "Excellent. I knew you'd see reason eventually." As they were being escorted toward a waiting wagon, Kaga caught Lena's eye and nodded toward the leather satchel she carried, the one containing copies of all the evidence they'd gathered. She understood immediately and began working the satchel's strap loose. When they reached the wagon, Kaga suddenly stumbled, bumping into one of the guards. In the confusion that followed, Lena tossed the satchel toward Tala, who had been following at a distance. The boy caught it and immediately melted into the crowd of onlookers. "Clumsy of me," Kaga said, steadying himself against the wagon. The supervisor's eyes narrowed. "Search them," he ordered. The search revealed weapons, but no documents. The supervisor's pleasant demeanor began to crack. "Where are the papers you took from Kensington's office?" he demanded. "What papers?" Lena asked innocently. "Don't play games with me. We know you have evidence that could cause problems for certain people. Where is it?" "Burned in the bridge collapse," Kaga lied smoothly. "Along with everything else." The supervisor studied their faces, looking for signs of deception. Finally, he shrugged. "It doesn't matter. With you two disposed of and your friends silenced, any remaining evidence will be dismissed as the fantasies of malcontents and troublemakers." As they were loaded into the wagon, both Kaga and Lena wondered if they'd made the right choice. They were heading toward almost certain death, banking everything on a 16-year-old boy's ability to get evidence to the right people. But sometimes, that's all you could do: trust in the decency of others and hope it was enough. The wagon rolled out of Angel's Crossing as the sun climbed higher, carrying them toward an uncertain fate. Behind them, Tala watched from the shadows, clutching the satchel that might be their only hope for justice. The territorial prison wagon rattled along the dusty road toward Silver Spur, but it never reached its destination. 20 miles outside Angel's Crossing, the supervisor called a halt in a canyon where the walls rose high on both sides and the road was barely wide enough for a single vehicle. "This will do," he announced, climbing down from his horse. "Remote enough that any gunshots won't carry and convenient for disposal afterward." Kaga and Lena exchanged glances. This was it, their last chance to fight back or die trying. But before either could act, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls. A single rider appeared around the bend, pushing his horse hard despite the heat. It was one of the supervisor's men, his face flushed with urgency. "Sir," he called out, reining in his lathered mount. "We have a problem. Big problem." "What kind of problem?" the supervisor demanded. "Federal marshals, sir. Real ones, not the territorial appointees we've been dealing with. They rode into Angel's Crossing an hour ago with warrants signed by a federal judge. Seems someone sent detailed evidence to Washington, including copies of financial records and correspondence." The supervisor's face went white. "That's impossible. We controlled all the telegraph traffic." "Not all of it, sir. That boy, the Indian's cousin, he got to the railroad telegraph office before we could stop him. Sent messages to every major newspaper and federal office he could reach." Kaga felt a surge of pride. Tala had done it, gotten the evidence to people who could act on it. "How much time do we have?" the supervisor asked. "Maybe an hour before they start following our trail. They've got experienced trackers with them, including some Army scouts who know this country." The supervisor paced back and forth, his composed demeanor cracking under pressure. Finally, he turned to his men. "Kill them now and scatter the bodies. We'll claim they resisted arrest and were shot trying to escape. But as his men drew their weapons, new voices echoed through the canyon, the sound of riders approaching from both directions. They were trapped caught between federal marshals and territorial authorities who might or might not be friendly. "Drop your weapons," a voice commanded from the canyon rim. "Federal marshals, you're surrounded." What followed was a brief but intense firefight as the supervisor's men tried to shoot their way out of the trap. Kaga and Lena threw themselves flat in the wagon bed, using its wooden sides for protection as bullets flew overhead. When the shooting stopped, the supervisor lay dead in the dust along with most of his men. The survivors were being rounded up by genuine federal marshals led by a gray-haired man with the bearing of someone who'd seen plenty of frontier justice. Marshal William Hendricks. The man introduced himself as he cut their bonds. "Sorry we couldn't get here sooner, but we had to verify all that evidence your young friend sent us." "Dorothea and Dr. Frederick?" Lena asked urgently. "Safe. We intercepted the transport taking them to Silver Spur and released them an hour ago. They're back in Angel's Crossing, probably worried sick about you two." As they climbed out of the wagon, Hendricks continued his explanation. "This investigation is going to be massive. We're talking about corruption that reaches from here to Washington, involving railroad companies, territorial officials, and federal appointees. It'll take months to sort out, and we'll need your testimony for the trials." "Gladly," Kaga replied. "Justice has been a long time coming." 3 months later, the territorial courthouse in Silver Spur was packed beyond capacity as the final trial in what newspapers were calling the territorial slavery conspiracy drew to a close. Dozens of men had been prosecuted, from local officials to railroad executives to federal appointees who'd been bought and paid for. Kaga sat beside Lena in the front row, watching as the prosecutor delivered his closing argument in the case against the surviving conspirators. Behind them, the gallery was filled with former victims, their families, and citizens who'd come to witness justice being served. "This case represents more than just individual crimes," the prosecutor declared. "It represents a systematic attempt to subvert the very foundations of American justice, to treat human beings as property, and to corrupt the institutions that protect our freedoms." The jury deliberated for 3 hours before returning unanimous guilty verdicts on all charges. Judge Morrison sentenced the defendants to lengthy prison terms, with several facing execution for their roles in multiple murders. Outside the courthouse, autumn air carried the promise of winter and new beginnings. As they walked through Silver Spur's busy streets, Lena took Kaga's arm in a gesture that had become natural over their months of working together. "Es ist wirklich vorbei," she said softly. "It's really over." "This part of it," he agreed. Question is what comes next. They'd spent the months since the Canyon shootout helping federal marshals track down the remaining conspirators and preparing for the trials. It had been dangerous work that had also given them time to explore the feelings that had developed between them during their harrowing ordeal. "Marshal Hendricks offered me a permanent position," Kaga said as they reached their hotel. "Deputy U.S. Marshal. Good pay, meaningful work. And I have Dorothea's offer to help run the school for immigrant women." Lena's smile was thoughtful. "Strange how being hunted like animals led us both to work we actually want to do." At her hotel room door, they paused, both aware that they were at another crossroads. The danger that had brought them together was over-replaced by the need to make conscious choices about their future. "There's something I need to tell you," Lena said, reaching into her satchel. "This came yesterday." She handed him a telegram from California. The message was brief, but life-changing. Her sister Anna was not only alive and well in San Francisco, but had married a successful merchant and wanted Lena to come live with them. "Your family," Kaga said, understanding the weight of the decision she faced. Yeah, after all these years, I have family again. She looked up at him, her blue eyes reflecting the evening light. But I also have something else I never expected to find. What's that? Instead of answering with words, she stepped closer and placed her hand over his heart. Home, she said simply. Not a place, but a person. Someone who sees me not as property or burden, but as an equal. He covered her hand with his, feeling the steady rhythm that had carried him through so much danger and uncertainty. But even as warmth spread through his chest, doubt crept in the old familiar voice that whispered of differences too great to bridge. The job in California, Marshal Hendricks mentioned they might need federal help with railroad investigations there too. He said carefully, "But Lena, I've never lived anywhere but this territory. Don't know if I could adapt to city life, to being around so many people who see me as..." He trailed off, unable to voice the fears that had haunted him since childhood. As what? She asked gently. As something less than human. You've seen how it is, the looks, the assumptions. In a place like San Francisco, surrounded by civilization. He shook his head. Maybe it would be better if you went alone, made a fresh start, without the complications I'd bring. Lena's eyes flashed with something between anger and hurt. You think I haven't faced the same looks, the same assumptions? You think being German in a territory full of people who still remember the war was easy? She stepped back, crossing her arms defensively. I thought we were past this, the idea that what other people think matters more than what we know to be true. It's not about what I think. It's about what life would be like for you, constantly having to defend your choices, explain why you're with the man who saved my life, who taught me to be strong, who's shown me more respect and kindness than any civilized man ever did. Her voice rose, then caught. My God, Kaga, do you really think so little of me that you believe I'd choose the easy path over the right one? The pain in her voice cut through his protective instincts like a knife. He realized that in trying to spare her future difficulties, he was essentially telling her she wasn't strong enough to face them, the same kind of condescending protection she'd been fighting against her entire life. I'm sorry, he said quietly. You're right. That was my fear talking, not my faith in you. She softened slightly, but the hurt remained in her eyes. I've spent my whole life having other people decide what was best for me, what I could handle, what I deserved. I thought you understood that I need to make my own choices, even if they're difficult ones. You do. You absolutely do. He stepped closer, his hands reaching for hers. And if you wanted to visit your sister but then return here, this territory needs the school, needs people willing to fight for justice. Then we'd make it work, she replied, her voice still careful. Together. The word hung between them, carrying the weight of everything they'd shared and everything they hoped to build. But now it also carried the fragility of trust that had been shaken, if not broken. I want to try, Kaga said finally. Whatever comes next, wherever it leads us. I want to face it with you. She studied his face, seeing the sincerity there mixed with residual fear and uncertainty. It won't be easy. There will be people who don't understand, who think we're making a mistake. Then we'll prove them wrong. One day at a time, one choice at a time. Finally, Lena rose on her toes and kissed him, not the desperate embrace of danger survived, but something softer and more complex. When they broke apart, both were smiling, but it was the careful smile of people who'd realized that love, while powerful, wasn't simple. Together, it is, she whispered, but with honest conversation about our fears not protecting each other from difficult truths. Agreed, he said, relief evident in his voice. No more assuming I know what's best for you. And no more assuming the worst about how others will react. Some will surprise us. 6 months later, the Angels Crossing School for Women had become a model for similar institutions across the territory. Lena had returned from a month-long visit with her sister in California, bringing with her new ideas and the financial backing of Anna's merchant husband. The reunion with Anna had been everything she'd hoped, and more tears, laughter, and hours of catching up on lost years. But it had also confirmed what she'd already begun to suspect: her life was no longer in the past, but in the future she was building with Kaga. "Anna understands," she told him as they walked along the banks of Snake River one evening. "She said she could see the change in me, the confidence. She's happy for us, and she wants to meet you properly someday." And her husband, curious about the man who tamed the wild frontier girl, as he put it. Lena's smile was wry. "I corrected that notion quickly enough. But yes, he's willing to welcome you as family if we choose to visit." The new railroad bridge stretched across the water ahead of them, stronger than its predecessor, and busy with the commerce that was transforming the territory. But some things remained constant: the flow of the river, the vast sky overhead, and the bond between two people who'd found each other in the worst of circumstances. Kaga wore a deputy marshal's badge now, one the ceremony of its presentation still fresh in his memory. Marshal Hendricks had placed it on his shirt with words that still echoed: "Justice needs people who understand both sides of the law and this land. There's no one better suited for that than you, son." The work took him across 3 territories, investigating crimes and protecting the rights of all citizens, regardless of their background. It was meaningful work that used his skills and honored his heritage. But the best part was always coming home to Angels Crossing and the woman who became the center of his world. "Any regrets?" Kaga asked as they paused to watch the sun set behind the mountains, his arm around Lena's waist. "About what?" "About choosing this life instead of the safety your sister offered. About taking risks that could have gotten us both killed." She considered the question seriously, then shook her head. "No regrets. If we hadn't fought, how many more women would have disappeared? How many more families would have been destroyed?" "Wakan," he said softly. "Sacred. That's what this is, this choice to build something good from something terrible." "Ja," she agreed, leaning into his embrace. "Sacred." As they stood together, watching the river flow toward the distant Missouri, both knew they'd found something precious in the crucible of shared danger and mutual respect. It wasn't the fairy tale ending that storybooks promised, but something better: a love earned through trial and sacrifice, tested by hardship, and strengthened by the choice to keep fighting for justice and each other. Behind them, Angels Crossing bustled with the sounds of honest commerce and legal proceedings. The school was preparing for its evening classes, where immigrant women learned English and their rights under American law. Dr. Frederick's clinic treated patients without regard to their ability to pay or the color of their skin. Dorothea's newest project was a library that would serve the entire territory, ensuring that knowledge remained free and accessible to all. They had built something worth defending, something that would outlast their individual lives. And they had built it together as equals, as partners in every sense of the word. The night wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain promises of seasons to come, and new beginnings yet to be written. And in that moment, standing beside the woman who'd changed his life and the territory they'd helped to heal, Kaga knew that some journeys were worth every step, no matter how dangerous the path.